So some of Africa is rising, and some of Africa is stuck. The question is whether the rising bit will pull the rest of Africa up, or whether the other Africa will weigh the continent down. Which will it be? Stakes here aren't just about them. Imagine for a second this last global recession, but without the economic growth of China and India, without the hundreds of millions of newly minted middle-class folks who now buy American and European goods. Imagine that. Think about the last 5 years. Rockstar preaches capitalism. Wow. Sometimes I hear myself and I just can't believe it. But commerce is real. That's what you're about here. It's real. Aid is just a stopgap. Commerce, entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid. Of course we know that.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
Well,
I don't even trust you to do that.
Over here.
Why is it we have so many millionaires and everything in the United States, and we still have so many impoverished people who try to get up into the world? Why is it we have this lack of money where people who can't support themselves decently and get a decent job, where all these big men are up on top making oodles and oodles of money? They don't need it. They can only eat that much, sleep in the bed.
And what do you suppose they do? If they don't eat it and don't use it, what do you suppose they do?
They hoard it.
What do you mean they hoard it? You mean they put it under their pillows?
That's right. No, they keep investing it.
Investing it in what?
That's right, yeah.
What do they invest it in?
Well, in oil and everything, where, I mean, all these other people who are
What do they invest it in? Don't get off the subject.
No.
What do they invest it in?
Well, they invested in a lot of different things that the little people need.
Well, do they invest it in factories?
Yes.
Does some of that money end up in machines?
Yes.
Do those factories and machines provide ordinary working people with jobs or not? What do you suppose the productivity of this country would be and of the wage rate would be if the total amount of capital in this country today was what it was 100 years ago? Where do you suppose the improvements in productivity come from except from the investment by people of their savings? But let me go to your fundamental question. First place, nirvana is not for this world. There is no paradise. Of course we've got a lot of people who are poorly off. But if you look at it over time, if you get a sense of proportion, the well-being of ordinary people has been the main thing that has been improved by economic progress and economic growth and development. And most residual hard cases of poverty today are the result, again, of a failure of government. Why do we have a black teenage unemployment rate in 30 to 40%? Because of two failures of government. One, a failure to provide decent schooling, which is a governmental responsibility. Has been, whether it should be or not, it has been. And second, because of a minimum wage rate, which prevents those kids who haven't had decent schooling from getting jobs at low pay at which they can earn the skills on the jobs that would enable them to rise to higher pay. If you look at the sources of poverty, you will find most of them are derived from what I regard as wrong-headed government policies.
But what you all are agreeing on but never stating until you're finally pushed to the wall to do it is that those cyclical periods of unemployment and then inflation in cycles are inevitable, and that it's only in a moderate way that those cycles can be ameliorated, but that economists of your stripe can do nothing about
Can
those
economists,
basic-
can anybody else? Excuse me. You said economists of our stripe. What economists can't do anything about it?
Well, there are different social systems.
Oh, but they have the same fluctuations. If you look at the tail, at the records of Russia or China, you have even more extreme fluctuations. They don't show up in the same way. But don't kid yourself in supposing that you don't have ups and downs in economic productivity and well-being in the case of Russia, in the case of China. Just look at the convulsions through which China has gone through. Just look at the, my goodness, how can you look at Russia and not recognize the millions of people who were killed in the collectivization crisis of the 1920s? Or if you look at the agricultural failures and the number of people who have starved to death or been in poor condition on account of that, you are just kidding yourself if you think that somewhere in this world there is a fluctuation-free society. The plain fact is that nobody of any stripe has been able to show how you get a perfectly stable, steady, certainty kind of a world except in two places, a prison and a grave.
But most of what I've heard you talking about has been about the distribution of income rather than about the distribution of wealth.
Yes.
Now, you wouldn't argue, at least I hope you wouldn't, that the person in, let's say India is genetically inferior, say, to the person in America. It's rather through the purely arbitrary circumstance of birth that he's in a country with a less developed economy or in a family that doesn't have as large a share of the capital. And that's not something that he's to blame for.
Oh, I'm not blaming anybody.
Even if the free market system equitably works and everyone progresses an equal amount, that person who started out with a lesser share of the capital is still going to end up with a lesser share of the capital.
That's right.
And there's nothing in the free market system that's going to enable him to make up for what was a purely arbitrary deficit in the first place. And given that the kind of people who become successful capitalists do not become that way by giving away their wealth voluntarily, isn't it necessary to forcibly redistribute wealth before you can begin to operate under a capitalist system?
No, it is not. The only way in which you can redistribute effectively the wealth is by destroying the incentives to have wealth. And the question is, what is the way, what is the system which will offer those people who are so unlucky as to be born without good positions, what is the system which will offer them the greatest opportunity?
Well, one possible way of redistributing the wealth without affecting the incentives to earn as much income as possible is simply to have a 100% inheritance tax. Since that won't affect the incentives, it's only after the person's dead anyway.
I beg your pardon. You're too, I'm afraid, I don't know the family you come from. I don't, but as you grow up, you will discover that this is really a family society and not an individual society. We tend to talk about an individualist society, but it really isn't. It's a family society. And the greatest incentives of all, the incentives that have really driven people on, have largely been the incentives of family creation, of family, of establishing their families on a decent system. What is the effect of 100% inheritance tax? The percent of 100% inheritance tax is to encourage people to dissipate their wealth in high living.
What's the harm in that?
The harm in that is that where do you get the factories? Where do you get the machines? Where do you get the capital investment? Where do you get the incentive to improve technology? If what you're doing is to establish a society in which the incentive is for people who, if they by accident accumulate some wealth, to waste it in frivolous entertainment. You know, the thing is that the thing that is amazing that people don't really recognize is the extent to which the market system has, in fact, encouraged people and enabled people to work hard and sacrifice in what I must confess I often regard as an irrational way for the benefit of their children. One of the most curious things to me in observation is that almost all people value the utility which their children will get from consumption higher than they value their own. Here are parents who have every reason to expect that their children will have a higher income than they ever had, and they scrimp and save in order to be able to leave something for their children. I think you are sort of like a bull in a china shop if you talk about the 100% inheritance tax having no incentive effects. It would destroy a continuing society. It would destroy a society.